Episode 9: The GOP Gives Up on Democracy. A couple of weeks ago, Utah Senator Mike Lee attracted attention by stating that the United States is not a democracy. Now, this is a particularly trite assertion that people on the right keep making every time they engage in anti democratic behavior, saying, "Oh, the founders created a republic, they did not create a democracy." Well, that is true, but it also ignores a bunch of amendments that have been added to the Constitution that basically make the US a popular democracy. Now, the United States Constitution is not particularly democratic. For example, there is nothing in the Constitution that really requires states to even have popular elections and how to assign their electors. The very presence of the Electoral College itself derives from the founders' lack of faith in the mob and their belief that the great unwashed were too uneducated and ignorant to make decisions on how to run the country, and educated and rich and wealthy elites like themselves were the ones who should be in charge. The Electoral College also has other darker underpinnings because the Electoral College was also there to protect the slave states, since slaves were used in apportionment of congressional seats, and slaves counted as 3/5 of a human to give the South more representation in Congress than it otherwise would have. The Electoral College artificially inflated the voting power of the South. Absent the Electoral College, in a straight up popular vote, the South would simply not carry as much weight. That dark history is something defenders of the Electoral College conveniently ignore today. The original Constitution had other non democratic provisions. The Senate was not directly elected until an amendment passed in the early 20th century. It was elected by state legislatures. Many states at the time had property restrictions on the ability to vote. And many of these restrictions were not actually removed until the 1830s, during the height of Jacksonian democracy. And you still see Republicans every so often wax nostalgically about, oh, we need to have property right restrictions on people to vote. Basically, people who rent property are not good citizens. Now, this is a dynamic not unique to the United States. The France, after the French Revolution and the Second French Revolution, and during the Second Empire of Napoleon III, maddeningly waxed back and forth between universal suffrage and property rights suffrage. After initially having universal suffrage, France under the Directory scaled it back and scaled it back further until during the Bourbon Restoration, voting was restricted to a very small minority. And after the 1830 revolution, while the franchise was slightly extended, the failure of Louis Philippe to expand the franchise beyond the upper class bourgeoisie helped bring him down in 1848. The Second Empire of Napoleon III, for all of Louis Napoleon's public pronouncements about democracy and freedom while he was not in power, gradually stripped away universal suffrage. And universal male suffrage did not really come to France until the creation of the Third Republic. And even then, women were not allowed to vote until the Fourth Republic in the aftermath of World War II. So the United States is not unique that way in the fact that a lot of our structures are undemocratic. And we delegate a lot of power to the states. Now, a lot of states over the years have adopted new constitutions that are fairly democratic, which have universal suffrage. State statutes have required states legislatures to assign electors based on the popular vote. But again, here's the fundamental problem. The Constitution specifically allows state legislatures the right to decide how electors are to be appointed. So there's nothing preventing a state from overriding the will expressed by its voters in assigning its electors. And given today's partisan polarization, unfortunately, it's not even clear whether this would hurt a party that ignored its voters in the next round of polls. And a month ago, this particular power of legislatures turned out to be a strategy that Donald Trump's lawyers were evaluating. Faced with an epic disaster and drubbing in the polls, and are desperate to stay in power to avoid his avalanche of cases against him from going forward, Trump's lawyers are looking for anything to keep him in power, and going to the legislatures is one of the things that they couldn't utilize. And this is a trend that has been going on with the GOP for a while. The problem with the GOP is that their demographic of voters is literally dying off. After 150 years of pissing off every ethnic minority in the country and every immigrant group in the country, the GOP demographic is a bunch of aging white voters for the most part. Most minorities overwhelmingly do not vote for the GOP. Even Asian Americans, who were conveniently tagged the model minority, in the last 20 years, 25 years, have gone from being 50-50 to like 75-25% Democratic voters. Now, there are exceptions. Vietnamese Americans and Cuban Americans, because of the history of anti-communism, tend to vote Republican more often than they do Democrats. And even there has been erosion of what used to be a solid bedrock of GOP support. So what is a party to do when it has a dying demographic? And increasingly, anybody who can look at numbers knows that this state of affairs cannot continue. Option one, which was proposed in the aftermath of Barack Obama's elections, was to wake up and try to diversify your appeal. And there were many in the GOP who called for that in the aftermath of Obama's election, and this was promptly ignored. Option two is to go what I have seen referred to once as the Mississippi option, where Mississippi has about 40% African American population, which overwhelmingly votes Democrat. Unfortunately, the 60% white population votes Republican in approximately the same level. So basically, you rely on racial polarization to keep yourself in power. But again, this is diminishing returns as white America increasingly is going to move from being a majority to a plurality. This is unsustainable as well. So the next solution is to attack basic democratic institutions. And this comes in many forms. One of them is gerrymandering, which, to be fair to the GOP, they are not unique in this. Democrats and states that are in power do the same thing. But what has happened is in the last decade, many public voters have got sick of the fact that they are sitting in gerrymandered congressional and state districts that are unreceptive to their needs. And as a result, they're stuck with representatives they would not otherwise elect. Starting with Iowa, a bunch of states decided to form boundary commissions where the power of the legislature was delegated to these commissions, who would then draw districts that were more equitable. These referendums passed in Arizona, and the GOP legislature promptly then went ahead and sued, saying this was unconstitutional since the Constitution gave the legislature the right to do this. Again, this was something the public in the state overwhelmingly supported in a referendum. And here comes the legislature to come and strip that away. This is not the only time the GOP has tried to undercut a referendum. They have done this in states that have voted to expand Medicaid, where the GOP, out of sheer spite, refuses to expand because it was something passed by Barack Obama. They have done this in referendums where, in Florida, felons who had served their time were given the right to vote. And the GOP basically reinstituted a poll tax by saying They need to pay off their fines, and our majority in the Supreme Court went along with this, ignoring the fact that Florida's fine structure is so convoluted, many of these people cannot even figure out what exactly they owe the state to get their voting rights back. And this is a Kafkaesque situation that basically keeps people in limbo, and it undermines the basic purpose of getting people back as good, productive citizens and engaged in our democracy. The other assault the GOP has been making the last few years is the attack on voting. In the aftermath of the civil rights era, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act, which was intended to prevent states, particularly the southern states, which has a long history of Jim Crow, from making it harder for minorities to vote. Along comes Chief Justice John Roberts, who for some reason was very, very offended by this statute. And in the aftermath of Barack Obama's election, where energized group of young minority voters turned out to elect the first African American president, the Supreme Court then went ahead with a 5-4 decision to strike down the Voting Rights Act, claiming that, hey, racism is a thing of the past, we don't need this anymore. And plus, you're picking on these poor little states. And so they struck down the acts that required these states to get pre-clearance from the federal government before putting restrictions that made it harder for minorities to vote. And guess what happens? The moment they passed these laws, Texas, Alabama, and all these southern states immediately went ahead and passed new statutes to make it harder for people to vote. The new justification for this is voter fraud. Again, there's a fine political tradition in here in the United States, particularly in urban centers like Chicago, of people who voted early and voted often. And let's be clear about this. Voter identity fraud of the type that the GOP claims is used to rig elections basically does not exist. If anybody tried doing it to rig an election, they are morons. And out of general principle, they should be pilloried for being so stupid in a way to rig an election this way. Nobody ever rigs an election from voter identification fraud. It is about as inefficient a way as there is to rig an election. It requires you to produce fake voter IDs, create enough voters to show up in force to rig an election. Every country, any government that actually rigs elections does it differently, and the much easier implement of rigging the counting process. And we saw this most recently in Belarus, where in the recent election, President Lukashenko's minions stuffed the ballot boxes, only to their horror to find out people were actually showing up to vote. And you actually saw people climbing out of polling precincts with these ballots in their backs because they had stuffed them, and now all these voters are actually showing up to vote. You saw it in the Green Revolution in Iran, where President Ahmadinejad's minions clearly rigged the vote to suddenly have him winning in a bunch of provinces by the same percentage points. Nobody rigs the elections with voter ID fraud. When rigging does happen, it happens by people mucking with the counting process. And this has held up time and again every time the GOP and particularly idiots like Chris Kobach have tried to actually prosecute people for voter ID fraud. There are a few cases of people who voted when they were not supposed to. Ironically, these dragnets have caught a bunch of Republicans who were so convinced after listening to Fox News that the Democrats were committing this fraud in droves that they needed to counterbalance it by breaking the law themselves. Oops. It has accidentally caught up people like the poor woman in Texas who had served her time in jail and thought she was entitled to vote, and evidently under Texas law she was not. And to make an example of her, the judge in question gave her a 5-year jail sentence. So voter ID fraud doesn't exist, but voter ID fraud does not exist, but the GOP has used that time and again to suppress the vote. And what do these restrictions do? First, you start out with ID laws. Well, then you had Alabama, where ID laws are required, but in all counties, in a bunch of rural counties with heavy African American population, they shut down Secretary of State offices, which would issue the IDs. You have Texas, which would allow only certain IDs, which conveniently were used by white voters but not by minorities. Make it hard to get an ID. Make people pay for the ID for their exercise their right to vote. And then you have even more pernicious methods in cutting polling locations. You have seen images of people standing in line for 8 hours. In a primary in Texas, you had some poor guy stand in line for 7 hours to vote in his primary. Why is that? Because in the last decade, ever since the Supreme Court decision, Texas has aggressively cut down polling locations in areas of high minority growth. And as a result, you have these long lines in minority areas. And you make it harder and harder for people to vote. And poorer people cannot just take the whole day off, since election day is not a paid holiday. And it becomes then the preserve of the wealthy who can, who, by the way, don't have to sit for 8 hours to vote either. So the GOP for a long time has been putting these structural barriers. They've been making it harder on people to vote. They oppose any method to make it easier for people to cast their ballot. In recent years, the new attack has gone against early voting, because the more days there are for people to vote, the less people and the shorter the lines on election day. Oh no, but that's too much for the GOP because, hey, fraud, I guess. So states like Wisconsin started cutting out the number of days of early voting. And this was on display during the pandemic in March in the Wisconsin primary, when the whole city of Milwaukee had like 3 or 4 polling locations for the whole city. And then came the pandemic, when a matter of public safety said made it impossible for you to have normal voting procedures. Of course, they did not stop the dingbat, who is the Speaker of the Wisconsin House, showing up to vote in full PCP and claiming, oh, it's safe to vote. Yeah, it is. You're wearing PCPs. Not everybody can do that. So a bunch of states then went ahead and tried to make it easier to vote, and the Democrats pushed for vote by mail. And along comes our new Postmaster General with his quote unquote reforms to the post office, which dramatically slowed down the mails. And then you had a bunch of GOP states trying to put restrictions on the vote by mail, refusing to approve restrictions, approve exemptions to make life easier for voters in the pandemic. In the upper Midwest, the GOP has taken the ridiculous position in many states that, hey, if you get all these mail-in ballots, you cannot start counting them until election day, which some states like Florida do, which is why when the Florida returns will come on Tuesday night, the mail-in ballot results will come promptly, because they will have been counted before election day. Now, there is a security angle, obviously. You don't want these results to leak out, but you know what? If you're going to get all these votes early, count it. It's efficient. But having prevented the states from counting votes early, they are now going to court and trying to demand that you cannot count these votes after November 3rd, which is absurd. There is no such requirement. If votes have come in legitimately, there is no such requirement that they have to be counted on election day. Most states do not certify their votes for a couple of weeks until the election process is done. But that does not stop our modern GOP. In Texas, Governor Abbott, shocked at the lines of people in urban areas which have tended heavily Democratic in the last decade, and the suburbs, where the GOP has now started pissing off educated suburban voters, making it even harder to gerrymander seats, came up with the brilliant idea that early voting locations drop boxes can only be in one location per county. And this is ludicrous on its face, because you have small counties. You have counties like Harris County, which is Houston, which are huge with millions of voters. You have counties that are the size of other states, and you can have only one drop box location? Seriously? For security? They're not even hiding their attempts to suppress voter turnout at all. And the more recent thing has been using the partisan hacks on the courts to try to crush these restrictions. Most recently, Justice Kavanaugh, probably swigging from the beer he likes too much, wrote a decision which was alarming in his utter ignorance how the electoral process works. And among other things, he claimed that Vermont had not changed its law in the current pandemic, leading to a protest by the Vermont Secretary of State that the justice was wrong on the facts. In the last couple of days, you have seen a partisan conservative activist file suit both in state court and at a local district court. Why is this? So, this is an example of where elections have consequences. In Texas, the county judge is basically the chief executive officer of the state, of the county. And Harris County, Texas, in the last election cycle, narrowly elected a Democrat. And what happened? Under the previous official, Harris County only spent about $4 million on elections. Under the new county judge, they are spending about $34 million. And as a result, it is now much easier to vote in Harris County. Many polling centers stayed up overnight a couple of days ago to address demand. And with the permission of the Republican Secretary of State of Texas, Harris County expanded drive-through voting. It's a pandemic after all. We want our voters to be safe. And following state procedures where you have certified election officials collecting their ballots makes it safe. There was an attempt to strike this down, which the Texas Supreme Court struck down. But our conservative hack is not satisfied. He's now filed suit in a federal court where you have another partisan conservative judge who is now hearing the trial and evidently is going to do the hearing without giving Harris County the time to respond on Monday. They tried also with the Texas Supreme Court, which turned it aside with no comment. Now, given our federal structure and given the unholy mess that is the American electoral system, there's a lot of deference given to state courts on decisions on interpretation of state law. But come back to Justice Kavanaugh. One of the footnotes in his decision was his acceptance of a ridiculous position adopted by Justice Rehnquist in Bush v. Gore, which, by the way, the conservative hacks in the court decided had no precedential value, because they have taken this weird position that giving people equal access to the vote and making every vote count is somehow a 14th Amendment equal protection violation for everybody else. And Kavanaugh is now asserting the right of the Supreme Court to overturn state Supreme Court decisions on state constitution and state law, which is a ridiculous position that Rehnquist could not get the other conservatives on the court back in 2000 to go along with. But here is Kavanaugh trying to push this. And this is a problem because they have just nominated another partisan hack, Amy Coney Barrett, to the Supreme Court. And Donald Trump has not been shy about saying that he expects the Supreme Court to come in his favor. Given the circumstances of her nomination, given the fact that Donald Trump has made it very clear, because Donald Trump is a moron and says the quiet stuff aloud, he's made it very clear he's relying on the Supreme Court to help get him elected. Amy Coney Barrett, if she had any sense of integrity or shame, should be recusing herself from these decisions. But as I said, she's a conservative hack. I do not expect her to do this. And most people believe that she will join the conservative hacks in the court in attacking and trying to tip any close decision in favor of Trump. The most recent one was also in Pennsylvania, which was a 4-4 decision. And among the fights that's happening now is because we are relying on vote by mail, can you count ballots that are received after election day but have a postmark of at least election day? Now, this is not controversial in most levels. This happens all the time, particularly with military ballots. That does not stop conservatives from now giving the nonsensical opinion, election day means election day, so get it in before then. Well, it doesn't have to be that. It's not something that there's nothing mystical about it. By being postmarked, it means you sent in your ballot. It's sort of how tax day works. Your tax return doesn't have to reach on April 15th. It has to reach on be postmarked. Now, to be fair, there are state statutes that are not clear on this point, but a lot of states and a lot of courts have given leeway given the fact that there's a pandemic. And this, again, has been complicated by the partisan hack who is now Postmaster General, who lacks a fundamental understanding of what the post office is about and whose incompetence has led to amazing mail slowdowns. If there is a federal investigation that should happen, it should happen what happened with the Postal Service. But, well, more on that later. So, as I said, you have the GOP, which in the last decade knows that it has a dying demographic. You have the GOP, most of whose public policy positions are actually phenomenally unpopular. Privatizing Medicare, killing Planned Parenthood, even ironically killing Roe versus Wade is not popular. The smart GOP people know this, which is why heavily anti-abortion Mike Pence danced around the question of what he would have done as governor of Indiana if Roe versus Wade was banned. GOP legislatures around the country have aggressively started putting abortion restrictions, but they're a bit like the dog chasing the ambulance and chasing the truck and then wondering what it does when it caught the truck. You saw this happen with Obamacare, when after years of saying Obamacare was the worst thing to ever happen to the American people, it turned out they didn't actually have a plan to replace it. And the plan that they proposed was ridiculously unpopular, which cost them the House. Ironically, if they had left Obamacare alone, the GOP would still have held on to the House, likely, and Donald Trump would never have been impeached. But Trump's Obama derangement syndrome made it essential they try to repeal Obamacare. So basically, you have a dying demographic. Their position on healthcare, and like with most of their policy prescriptions, is heavily unpopular. You're relying on an increasing minority of the public. They're holding on to power basically because of an antiquated political system designed 200 years ago by founders who could not fathom the huge population differences between a state like Wyoming and a state like California, which as a result gives the GOP an advantage in the Senate because for now they're winning these rural states which have much smaller populations but have the same number of senators as California. And then come Tuesday, the GOP is going to achieve an accomplishment unparalleled in recent political history. And this is something actually they're going to achieve which even the Democrats at their nadir in the aftermath of the Civil War did not achieve. For the 7th time in 8 presidential elections, the GOP candidate will lose the popular vote. Let me repeat that. For the 7th time in 8 presidential elections, starting with 1992, the GOP candidate will win the popular vote. Now, they have won 3 out of the last 7 presidential elections, but twice it was after losing the popular vote. If Donald Trump does pull off a miracle on Tuesday, it will be after heavily losing the popular vote by even bigger margin. Ironically, in 2004, George W. Bush almost lost the popular vote, almost won the popular vote and lost the Electoral College, which would have led to a very different discussion about the Electoral College had that pulled off, but I digress. So again, this is a party that is not popular, that is not winning the popular vote. And as I said, even the Democrats, because in President Cleveland's 3 runs, they won the popular vote 3 times, they just lost the Electoral College once. And also in the election at the end of Ulysses Grant's term in 1876, the Democrats won the popular vote. So even the Democrats at their low point then did not struggle as badly in the national popular vote as the GOP has done. And again, what do you expect? You have a party that has unpopular positions, it has a dying demographic, it really has no ideas for the future other than tax cuts and cutting any regulation regardless of whether it helps people or not. And as a result, it has given up on democracy. The GOP traditionally, and this is not always the case, in Florida, which allowed mail voting, the GOP has done fairly well, even though they do small little voter suppression things by preventing people from getting back on voter purges and preventing people from getting their franchise back or and other restrictions like that. In Texas in 2018, Beto O'Rourke dramatically raised turnout, but the GOP raised that turnout enough to hold on for Ted Cruz to have a narrow victory. But again, it's harder and harder to sustain this because as Donald Trump alienates educated, college educated white people, as the COVID pandemic and his incompetence is possibly costing them their reliable base of old white voters, who is the GOP going to turn to? Now they're relying on non-college educated white voters, which is also a shrinking demographic. They have some hope because in certain Latino evangelical votes, they're doing fine. But general, the trend lines are clear. It's a declining voter base. And the only way they win is by suppressing the vote, by making it harder for people to vote. Spurious claims of voter fraud. Today, Donald Trump ran his mouth again, as usual, and basically promised, and one of his flacks, Jason Miller, promised that if he's leading the vote on election night, he's going to declare victory, which is ridiculous. It has no standing in law. Election results are called on election night by news organizations based on projections. They are not final and official, which is why in 2000, Florida was called for George W. Bush. That didn't end the election. Florida kept on counting. And then they found it was too close to call, and the networks reversed their call. But that does not stop our current GOP. They don't care. So, as a result, you're going to have Donald Trump on Tuesday night trying to claim victory even though votes have not been counted. And then he's going to go to court and then he's going to pretend that the remaining votes should not be counted because it is fraud. It's ridiculous. And the sad part is there are partisan hacks on the federal courts who will buy this argument. And that is a very, very scary thing for American democracy. The GOP is the only major political party in the Western world that basically has turned its back on democracy. Its ideas are not popular. They don't have a majority. Their demographic is dying. And rather than adapt and improve their ideas and win popularity, they have decided to go the fascist route and suppress the popular vote. It is sad. It is sad that the party that freed the slaves is now the new party. Is the sad the party that freed the slaves? It's the sad the party that initially fought against the Ku Klux Klan is now a party that is actively trying to suppress the franchise, which openly has turned its back on democracy. On that cheerful note, that's it for this episode. There'll be more to come. There'll be more episodes coming in the run-up to Election Day because I have 8 months to catch up on and a lot to get off my chest. So expect some more stream of consciousness episodes to come in coming days, and I will see you soon.
Welcome to Liberté, Egalité, Fraternité and all that, a podcast about current affairs, foreign policy, politics, and governments behaving badly.